So you in this essay, which I think is called "Nothing." Is it "Nothing Matters"? No, it's what's it called? It's
Nothing Applies.
Nothing Applies.
This is a line from "Play It As It Lays."
Right, and it's largely the essays uses "Play It As It Lays" in particular, and would you say it? I mean, there's a line that caught my attention early about her line. Well, it's from the book. We tell ourselves stories in order to live, which is true. And then it gets into the question of, well, what if you can't take the stories seriously? What if, which becomes kind of like saying, what if you're, I mean, you tell me, is that the same as saying, what if you're borderline nihilistic? You're wondering whether there really is a larger meaning or any absolute values, or wondering, are we talking partly about kind of moral relativism and nihilism here?
Well, I mean, these pieces are connected, but I think in order for clarity's sake, we need to sort of identify each of them.
Mm-hmm.
One thing is her view on narratives, and she has, in the essay, I say one of the things that's really hard about writing about Didion is that so much of her work is characterized by kind of ambivalence, right? And so, on the one hand, she thinks narratives are absolutely necessary in the sense that we feel a terrific need to be able to view our lives and our activities as part of some story that has a kind of an internal logic to it, and that at some point at the end will in some way vindicate us, right?
Your life will add up to something in the way.
She also, though, is of the view, she's very dubious, A, that these stories are true,
mm-hmm.
and B, that it's particularly good for us to hold on to them. I mean, the fact that you think you need something or desperately want something doesn't mean it's good for you. And certainly in the book Play It As It Lays, which is, look, it's not a didactic book. It's not a book where she's presenting a theory of any kind.
Right.
But certainly, you certainly get the impression. I mean, the only person who really comes through the book, I mean, she comes through damaged, but she does come through, is precisely the person who no longer believes in these narratives and who just plays the game of life. Without expectation, without a story to sort of fill it all in.
This is the character Maria in the book?
Yeah, Mariah Wyatt. Yeah.
And then there's another character who also kind of lets go of stories, but winds up in a more depressing place, right? Kills himself.
So I don't know whether, how do you feel about spoilers?
Well, the spoilers in the essay, so I don't know. I mean...
Yeah, you're right, fair enough. So, I mean... Look, the book, near the end of the book, her best friend, the only person who she's really close to, commits suicide. And he commits suicide because he has finally come to understand that the narratives are false and is devastated by it, right? And the narratives in this case have to do with post-World War II, American dream, California, film industry, make it big, make it rich, sexual revolution, all the sort of the elements of what we would take to be sort of, stardom and success in the post-war era.
And he loses faith in the value of these things. He just comes to think it really doesn't matter.
Right. He comes to realize that it's all terrible, right? And look, throughout the book, you come to, it's hard not to see how terrible it is. The sexual liaisons are meaningless and predatory. The business end of it is dirty and disgusting.
This sounds like more of a critique of a particular culture and lifestyle than questioning whether there is meaning anywhere, right? I mean, it's an indictment of a set of values that are actually pretty easy to indict and are commonly indicted, right?
Right, but that's just the novel. This theme recurs in her other writings, in her essays, and also even in the novel. If you read the opening sequence, which I reproduced in the essay, at least the character of Mariah does generalize this point. She says, why does a coral snake require 2 glands of neurotoxin to survive, whereas a king snake, which looks exactly like it, requires none at all? And then she goes on to repeat a story of a couple being killed by a coral snake. And so, this is a classic, typical sort of thing, right? This happens to you, and let's say these are your parents, and you say, well, why did this happen? And you look for a reason, right? You look for something to make it meaningful, so it's not just empty and pointless. And so I think by the examples that Mariah gives at the beginning, the intent is that this is a general point, not just one about California, Hollywood, fast living sort of lifestyle. It's meant to sort of apply, I think, to everything, right?
Yeah. And we all do have stories about ourselves and like what we're good at and why our lives have value and what we hope to have accomplished by the end. And
right.
I don't actually want to lose all those stories personally.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, who wants to lose them? The question, I think that what Didion's doing, and again, she's ambivalent. So this is not a skeptical essay, right? She's ambivalent. I mean, she recognizes the need for it. She recognizes what they do for us, but she also recognizes that they're probably false. At some point, you're going to find out they're false. And the question then is, how do you handle that? How do you cope with that? And it's very hard to cope with. Now, there's a connection, but one thing, there's a connection between this point about the narratives and the stuff that she wants to say about morality, but it's not a seamless sort of connection. I mean, so, if you want to move to talk about her views of morality and stuff, we can, but it's not a seamless run from this point about the narratives to the point about morality.
Okay, you're right. So it doesn't necessarily imply moral relativism. You mean?
I don't think so. I don't think so.
It's interesting. I don't want to get too far into this, but I spend a lot of time kind of in the culture of Buddhist meditation, mindfulness, and this idea of questioning the stories we tell ourselves is very much a part of modern day mindfulness practice. I don't want to say it's so much a part of Buddhist practice traditionally, but certainly contemporary Western mindfulness, it's fairly explicit in, and there's a connection with traditional Buddhist practice and philosophy. I mean, it's just more, I think, the idea that, of observing your narratives and not following them mindlessly is very much a part of modern mindfulness practice. And kind of interestingly, and I think not totally unrelatedly, in Buddhism, the question of nihilism arises and has arisen for a long time about Buddhism. The question of whether there's the danger of acquiring such a, you might say, objective view of all your impulses and your intuitions about truth and so on, might lead you to question whether there's any kind of truth at all, any kind of moral absolutes at all. So I don't, we needn't dwell on that, but it kind of occurs to me.
But I think that's very interesting. I mean, we all are familiar with the concept of a useful fiction. But it's also worth being warned a little bit about how we think of those fictions and that we remain aware of those fictions. I mean, look, there are, of course, harmless fictions. The one that I mentioned at the beginning of the essay about, where me and my longest standing friend first met. Neither of us can remember, and at some point in our childhood, we came up with a story about where it was, which I'm sure is false, right? But A, I know it's a fiction, and B, not very much rests on it, right? It does provide a nice sort of story. It provides me with a sort of, and it's something that if I'm not thinking about it too hard, I actually half believe, right? This is something we tell to each other as well as to other people, even though we both know it's false. I think that Didion at some level understands that there is no getting rid of all the fictions. I mean, the character of Mariah is in many ways not a character you'd want to be, right? There's no way of no getting rid of all the fictions, but there is a way of not losing oneself in the fiction, and there is a way of not constructing fictions that are so central to your capacity, sort of, to live and to be happy, that when they're unmasked, you're broken, right?
Right.
I mean, and that seems to me to be, if you were to take lessons from her, which again I don't think she's trying to do. She's not a didactic writer, but if you were to take lessons from her, I think that would be one of them. I think it's a good one.
Well, I think the claim of a lot of proponents of modern mindfulness teachings would be that really critically interrogating your narratives can actually lead to a fully more mentally healthful situation. Whereas in this book, it sounds like you've got two people who question the narratives. One of them commits suicide. The other kind of finds a way to survive, period. Right. But it's not like, as you say, not necessarily recommended that you try this at home.
Right. And there's a lot of, there's many dimensions to the book and to the character. And one of the dimensions that really explains how she's able to do this is that she comes from a family of gamblers. Mm-hmm. So she essentially has a gambler's ethos, and thus expects that at any moment she may go boom or bust. Right. And in a sense, these are tough people, right? Because they have had to get used to being completely devastated in a moment, right? And having everything turned upside down on you in a moment. And so throughout the book, you can see her drawing from that background, and it's actually a source of strength, but it's also something that causes her to be completely disconnected from everybody else, right? Mm-hmm. And she is pretty much alienated from everybody else in the book, especially her ex-husband, Carter.
Uh-huh. Now, this book features in a course you teach there at Missouri State that, you're in the philosophy department, but it's a course that draws on, I guess, literature and journalism. And you also, if I remember correctly, there's a Bret Easton Ellis reading. Is that right? And he, that's another person. I know I should have read him. But the thing about him is, when Less Than Zero came out, I remember what a sensation it was. And all I remember about that is it was about, his generation, which would have been Gen X, I guess, right? And they were, if I remember the reviews correctly, they were essentially nihilistic, thrill seekers, and I remember thinking that he had so overdrawn the portrait that it just seemed to be done for the sake of shock value. I just remember reading what these people were supposedly doing and thinking, are there really many people who do this kind of stuff? Right? They were. Am I misremembering?
Well, it was. So let me say a little bit about this. I'm a huge fan. I actually wanted to talk. I want to talk to him on Blogging Heads, but I have no idea how one gets to such a person. I might email you privately about that.
Well, when someone's book comes out, their publicist is a good way. But